Dante. This is a high point of the world's literature and culture, and one of my favorite topics anyway. Okay, Dante Alighieri was the man's name, but everyone calls him simply Dante. He was born and he grew up in Florence, Firenze, I think Koreans call it. And as usual, the Korean is close to the native. In Italiano, Firenze. And in Korean, I think similar. Okay, I think you know where Florence, as we call it in English, is. Florence is in north central, let's say, Italy. Glorious place, one of the best places in the world, I think, to visit. Okay, Dante was born in 1265. He died in 1321. So he comes kind of at the end of the glorious period of the Middle Ages, just before things really started to fall apart. That is the medieval synthesis, as it's called, started to fall apart just after Dante's death. Okay. His family origins, let's say upper middle class, but not wealthy at all. He received a pretty good education, thought about entering the church, but decided that what he really loved was politics. Now, curiously, Florence was a city-state, really. And it's a very curious thing that two, at least, of the very highest points of Western civilization were reached in these city-states, not in the national state of modern times. One can speculate about why. It's hard to say, but that's the way it was. In both cases, too, Athens and Florence, 5th century BCE Athens and 15th century Florence, we had a city-state that was powerful, but that certainly eventually would be overcome by the much larger and more powerful national states, foreign, from outside of Italy. Dante. He tells the story in his first important work, which is called La Vita Nuova, New Life, an account of his early life that contains prose and poems. And the prose sets up the poems, and then he discusses the poems too. Very interesting. Anyway, he tells there, in La Vita Nuova, about how he first saw Beatrice, as we call her in English, Beatrice, when he was 9 years old. She, I think, was 10. I think she was slightly older than he was. I don't remember that exactly. But he was smitten, as we say in English, struck, impressed. Impressed is not the word. He was stupefied by her. Now, she came from a class that was higher than his, so he never really got to know her. Next time he saw her was about 3 years later, and this time he was even more struck and decided that this was the woman to whom he would dedicate himself in an ideal sense. It was never a question of meeting her, having a relationship with her, or marrying her. This was impossible from the start. A few years later, he saw her again. By this time, she was married, I think. Always she was surrounded by other girls and women in that kind of protective society, very protective of its women. Okay. She died when she was 21, I think. And this just further helped him to resolve to write something worthy of her, to be worthy of her. Because as the years went along, more and more he conceived of her not as an individual, but as symbolic of higher things. And ultimately, she would become symbolic of the very highest things, though not God himself, or not the Godhead itself. Okay. Other works followed in which he showed his learning. He read widely, studied hard, studied theology especially. But again, his interest in politics was huge, and he was interested in the political fate of his country, Italy. And he had a kind of vision of Italy unified. These great Italians often did. Machiavelli was another 200 years later. Because Italy never unified until 1871, only 130 years ago. Only in 1871 did Italy become a unified country. Okay, now he became interested in politics and, as I said, wanted to have a political career. Italy was, Florence and Italy really, were divided politically, as places tend always to be divided. Dante was a member of a political party called the Guelphs, and the other major political party was the Ghibellines. Now the Guelphs generally favored the Vatican, the influence of the Pope and the Church, because against that the Ghibellines favored the influence of the Holy Roman Emperor, German usually, but not always. And the Emperor and the Pope were always at odds. So really one had to choose which one favored, because both wanted to have influence in Italy and in Florence. The Guelphs were divided into two parties, the black and the white Guelphs. Now I always get this confused and I don't care much, but Dante was a member of the white Guelphs, let's say, and around 1301, I'm going to say 1302, remember his dates, 1265, 1321. Around 1301, 1302, Dante's party, the white Guelphs, was in power in Florence. And Dante himself was sent on a mission, a diplomatic mission, to make some treaty, some agreement with Orvieto, I'm not sure anymore, it doesn't matter. During his absence, the black Guelphs took over. And a takeover there was similar to a takeover in Athens, just as I told you about the death of Socrates, when the oligarchs lost power to the Democrats, let's say. This was disastrous because this meant that they took advantage of, they banished or arrested or confiscated the property of various people. Dante was banished from Florence, and he loved Florence, and he never returned the rest of his life. He spent the rest of his life, roughly 20 years, wandering from place to place, kind of under the protection of various people, the guest of various people. But it was a hard life in some ways, at least, this life of exile, and he writes about that later in a famous passage. Okay, but now he started to write his major work, which would become La Divina Commedia, the Divine Comedy. And this is one of the 2 or 3 greatest works of literature in the Western world, along with Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, I guess. Iliad, definitely. And maybe Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Nothing else can stand of that scope. If you include all of Shakespeare's great tragedies, yes, they together certainly equal or surpass these, but no individual one does. Okay, the Divine Comedy. The structure and meaning and diversity and drama of this work are all just wonderful. Okay, in this work, Dante says that, okay, first I better describe the structure. It's divided into 100 canti. That's the plural word of canto. A canto, each canto contains from, on an average, 145 lines. So 145 times 100 equals 14,500 lines. That's about how long the Divine Comedy is, 14,500 lines, which makes it quite long as an epic poem, because mostly people call it an epic poem. Okay, these 100 canti are then divided as follows: 33, 33, 33, and 1. The first canto is a kind of introduction. After that, the next 33 have to do with Dante visiting hell, or the Inferno. The second group of 33 show him visiting Purgatory, il Purgatorio, it's called. And the third show him visiting Paradise, il Paradiso. 33, 33, 33, 1. In the first canto, Dante says that he was halfway along his road of life. Well, that means biblically we have 70 years. We can expect maybe 70 years of life if we're relatively fortunate. So that meant that he was 35 years old. At this time, he says he was lost in dark woods, famous dark woods. Now, the dark woods here that he means are symbolic of error, ignorance, sin, heresy, Heresy, that is false teachings, false ideas, despair, all that, dark woods. He had lost his way. And in these woods he wanders and wanders painfully, and he comes to a mountain, and he decides he must climb this mountain to escape. When he climbs up the mountain a little way, he encounters 3 animals who are symbolic too. A lion, a wolf, and leopard. Each of these represents a different kind of sin or danger to him. Now, he's confronted with these 3 terrifying symbolic monsters. And at that time, then, the Virgin Mary from Paradise sees his distress. And she calls Saint Lucy, who is the saint of vision, eyesight really, to her and says, let's try to help that poor Dante. And Lucy calls Beatrice, who's of course in paradise already. Lucy and Beatrice then go down to hell. They go to a special section of hell called Limbo. We'll see that in a little while. And they go to visit Virgil. Virgil was the great Roman poet, Roman epic poet, and Virgil was a hero of the Middle Ages, in Italy especially, but outside Italy too. He wrote in Latin, of course. A great poet. He wrote the Roman epic poem called the Aeneid, Aeneid. He was a hero of Dante's anyway. And so the 2 women go to Virgil and say, Virgil, please, if you're willing, will you please go up to earth and help Dante and guide him, if he's willing, through hell, show him what hell is, guide him, if he's willing, through purgatory. You can't guide him beyond there because you are a soul in hell. By the way, just so we understand, Virgil, why is Virgil in hell? Virgil died before the time of Christ. He died in 19 BCE in fact. But one of his poems refers to the coming of a kind of Messiah-like figure. And during the Middle Ages, people believed, or tried to believe, that Virgil had somehow prophesied the coming of Christ. Well, that's absurd, but people wanted to believe it, and Virgil was a very a very good man. And so, why then is he in hell? He's in hell because he was born before the Christian message. In the Christian message, Christ, after all, offered salvation and hope of eternal life. Anyone born before Christ's time, of course, never heard that message of hope and salvation, and therefore, by that fact alone, is in hell. But don't worry, Virgil's in a kind of nice section of hell. Anyway, Virgil says, sure, I'll go. And he goes up to earth, finds Dante, and says, Dante, some wonderful women came to me in hell and asked me if I would come and try to help you. If you want my help, please come with me. And Dante is very glad. Now, let's establish something right away. The Dante in the poem, the Dante whom we've met already, and who will travel through hell, through purgatory, and through paradise, is usually called Dante Pilgrim, as to distinguish him from Dante Author, because Dante Pilgrim and Dante Author are certainly very different. Dante Pilgrim is going to get an education, the greatest education in the world in a way. And Dante Author, of course, is writing about Dante Pilgrim and follows him from a very naive and ignorant condition to the point of his beatitude or beatific vision, special vision, which he will have at the end. So, Dante and Virgil begin their long trip. First they enter hell, and they are going to go down hell. Hell is conceived of as being under the ground, of course, and they will visit layer by layer or ledge by ledge of hell all the way to the center of the earth, because hell was created, mythically, by the fall of Lucifer, the rebellious angel in heaven, who rebelled against God and fell until, boom, he hit the earth, and his fall created hell. When he fell all the way to the center of the earth, where he still is, Lucifer, Satan. His fall displaced some of the ground under the earth, and that in turn was pushed up to create Mount Purgatory on the other side of earth, where people had never been. So down go Dante and Virgil. They begin in the vestibule, as it's called, which is kind of the outer courtyard. The vestibule comes before the river Styx, S-T-Y-X. Now Dante's work is full of classical myth, that is Greek-Roman myth, mythological people, mythological things, myth. River Styx, he will include many classical things. Now the vestibule, though, is where people who never really committed themselves to good or evil will spend eternity. And Dante says he could never believe that that many people had died. Well, what this clearly implies is, for Dante at least, and maybe this is an interesting idea, most of us will not qualify for even for hell. We won't qualify for hell, and certainly not for purgatory, or certainly not for paradise. But rather we will be blown here and there by the winds that fill the vestibule of hell, having never committed ourselves to anything. And the winds blow, and the souls follow first in this direction, and then they're blown in this direction, and in different direction. Okay, so that's most, says Dante. Now this is an early stage of the poem, and one wonders if this would have been Dante's belief by the time he reached the end of the poem, because it took him 16 years to write the poem, after all. But I think it probably was his belief, and it's a pretty good one too. Then Dante crosses the river Styx, Dante and Virgil, and they enter the first circle. Now the first circle is limbo, and limbo is a well-lit area, and the air is kind of clean. It's not the sun, it's not absolute light, it's mysterious light, but it's light at least. And this is where the virtuous pagans are. Virtuous, that is good, pagans, like Virgil. This is where Virgil will spend eternity. Also there are Homer and Horace and Statius and other classical authors. And one of the nicest moments of the poem, and is full of nice moments, comes when Virgil and Dante arrive in limbo. The other poets, his friends, greet Virgil. Virgil goes over and talks with them. They're so happy to see Virgil. And they talk for a moment, and clearly they're talking about Dante, because Dante is standing at a distance. And then they turn around, and Virgil welcomes Dante to join them. Very touching moment, great moment actually. And Dante is very happy to join these people whom he admires and respects. But on the other hand, they have been denied the hope of the Christian message. Okay, moving on. The sins of hell are arranged in a certain order, of course. From the carnal sins, sins of the flesh, that is sexual lust, gluttony, eating and drinking too much, and things like that, to the more, and then anger, as kind of a transitional thing, to the sins of heresy, wrong beliefs, which are more serious, to the terrible sins of rejection of God, just violent rejection of God, including suicide, for example. So Dante and Virgil will visit each of these ledges and descend down, 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 down. In that second circle, he visits the carnal sinners, that is, the sinners who sinned in the sense of lust. And he visits another very famous scene. He sees Paolo and Francesca. They were lovers. Francesca married Paolo's brother, who was deformed, a kind of cripple and a bad guy. And Paolo and Francesca fell in love with each other and had a love affair, and then brother, found out and killed them both. So in Dante's Catholic, I haven't really mentioned this, but Dante's poem is profoundly Catholic. It's a monument to Catholicism. And yet, for 400 years, the Divine Comedy was listed on the Index. The Index was, I don't think it exists anymore, I hope not, the Roman Catholic list of those books that Catholics must not read for danger of heresy and false teachings. So, although it's a very Catholic book, the Divine Comedy was proscribed, that's the word, outlawed, by the Roman Catholic Church for a long time. The main reason for this is that Dante included in hell many popes. Roma Puhwal. Roma Puhwal Pope? Kyohwang. Nah! How many times? Okay. That's the reason why the Catholic Church and bishops and cardinals and archbishops, high church officials, are many of them in hell. Dante puts them there. Courageously and good. So anyway, it's a very Catholic work, and according to Catholic doctrine, Paolo and Francesca, when they were killed, when they were murdered, died still in sin. That is, they had never had a chance to expiate or atone for their sin. They died in sin, hell. Now, I'm telling you this story, first of all, because it's very famous, and second of all, it shows something very important. when Dante hears their story, Francesca tells the story, Dante is moved to tears. He's deeply moved by this story. And Virgil scolds him harshly. Because what's happening here is Virgil represents reason and philosophy. Dante represents man, normal man. Virgil scolds Dante because Dante misunderstands what's happening here. These people willfully committed a sin against the will of God. One should not feel sympathy for them. They made a choice. And the profoundest thing about this, and the profoundest thing about any doctrine of hell, I think, is that the people who are in hell have chosen to be there, and in fact would rather be there than anywhere else. If hell has any reality, if one believes in hell, one can believe that the people in hell have chosen to be there, and in a strange way are actually happier there than anywhere else. Now, the same thing could be extended even to some conditions in this world. That is, some people's lives, some people's psyches are so twisted by sin, really, pride, or refusal to accept truth, rejection of love, rejection of happiness, rejection of friendship, rejection of all the good things of life. But the strange thing is that they are happier, in a profound sense, they are happier in that rejection than they would be by choosing the religious or sane course. Okay. Moving on, Dante and Virgil go layer by layer, ledge by ledge. At each ledge, Dante talks with people, and they tell him his story. At first, they don't want to tell him the story because, after all, Dante is still alive, and they can see that. But Dante persuades them, or Virgil persuades them. These people don't want to tell the story because they're embarrassed. They know that Dante can go back to the world and tell the story of their lives and their sin, their eternal fate. But Dante hears all these stories, and we hear the stories too. And we follow Dante's reaction. Now, what is one of the most wonderful things about the whole poem is Dante's education. Dante Pilgrim, as Dante goes deeper and deeper into hell, toward the depth of hell, Dante understands more and more the nature of evil, what evil is, what sin is, how these things are a rejection of God, a rejection of happiness, a rejection of light and hope and love. And Dante becomes much more intelligent, and Virgil is always lecturing him and correcting him. Virgil, again, equals reason or philosophy. And in a sense, the subject matter of the whole Divine Comedy is the education of Dante Pilgrim. The Germans have a term for this in the genre of literature, that is a Bildungsroman. A Bildungsroman, in German, is a novel that deals with the education of the hero. It's a Germanic approach to things especially, but generally it's European too, if it's not universally human. Anyway, in a strange sense, in a wonderful sense, Dante's Divine Comedy is a Bildungsroman, although it's a poem. Okay, down, 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 down he goes. He encounters mythical people, Ulysses, Odysseus from the Odyssey. He encounters kings and queens, emperors from the Roman past, even from the world of Islam, and especially he encounters Italians from the church, from warriors and fighters, to just other people who became famous, and Dante puts them in hell. Now, some people don't like this, that Dante presumes to judge so many people. But it shows one characteristic of Dante, which is a real good one, I think. Dante was a passionate believer in justice. And he applied this justice where he saw it. But anyone who reads the poem knows that Dante doesn't know where God is putting people after their deaths. Dante doesn't know their eternal fate. So these characters whom he puts in hell are really just there to illustrate, to show us one conception, one idea of hell, what hell and purgatory and paradise might be. And that's all it is. It's just a poem. But it's a very entertaining and educational and moving and wonderful poem. Down, down, down. When Dante reaches the very bottom of hell, he finds a frozen lake. So the very center of hell is a frozen lake. The ice is kept as ice because Satan, Lucifer, is down there, and he's fanning his wings. And that wing, those wings, the fanning of the wings, produces the cold air, which freezes the ice and keeps it frozen. Down there, I'll tell you one story that he tells. He's walking along the frozen ice with Virgil, and his foot hits someone who's half in and half out of the ice. Now, many of those souls down there are all the way under the frozen water, Dante says. That is, he doesn't see them. They are totally under the ice, but that's where they want to be. Their souls are so cold, so full of despair or pride, and despair is pride, that one can't see them. But he kicks someone, and then he hears this story. This is the story of Count Ugolino. Count Ugolino, a high aristocrat, was from Pisa, Leaning Tower of Pisa, blah, blah, blah. His enemy was the Archbishop of Pisa, high church official. And they were always fighting and always causing each other trouble. But then they decided to make peace. And so the cardinal, I don't remember his name, invited Count Ugolino to make peace. But when Ugolino arrived there where the archbishop was, with his 4 sons, the cardinal or the archbishop betrayed them, broke his promise, and arrested them and put them in a prison. This prison was in a tower, no escape. They stayed in the tower for many days. But then, Ugolino is telling this story, then one day, no food arrived. And then, hours later, no food arrived. And then he and his sons all realized that the archbishop was going to starve them to death. And Ugolino tells the story about the death of his little son, very moving. His little son, maybe 12 years old, asking father to help him. More days pass, his other sons die, he himself goes blind, and then finally he dies. Now, what are they doing in hell? Ugolino and the archbishop are there together in hell. And Ugolino is eating the skull, the head, of the archbishop there, and that's their punishment. Of course, he can't really hurt him very much, but their eternal punishment is to spend time together there in hell, in that frozen lake. Why? Because both of them are so consumed by hatred for the other and rage. Well, it's a terrible punishment, but somehow there's some justice there too. Okay, when Dante reaches Satan, of course Satan is a huge giant, and there are other giants down there too, guarding the lake. Huge giants that look like towers in the distance until Dante comes close to them and realizes that they are giants from classical myth. When Dante and Virgil reach Satan, they actually have to climb down the body of Satan and then climb up the legs, because they've reached the center of the earth, and now suddenly they're going up. They're no longer going down. They climb up the legs, they find a path, and they follow this path. It takes them a day, hard. They walk up that path, up that path. What they are doing is walking back up to the surface of the earth. But the other side of the earth, they've come down hell to the center, and now they're going up to the other side of the earth, the surface of the earth. The final word of the Inferno, the first section, hell, the final scene, Dante and Virgil are coming out. It's nighttime, and Dante sees the stars. The final word of the Inferno is stelle, stars. This will also be the final word of the Purgatorio, the final word of the Paradiso. And this will give you some idea of the almost infinite number of correspondences or cross-references. What I mean, for example, is if in Canto 5 of the Inferno, Dante is talking with Paolo and Francesca, the lovers, in Canto 5 of the Purgatory, he's also talking with lovers, but these ones are saved. And then in Canto 5 of the Paradiso, he's also talking with lovers, but these are in paradise already. Everything corresponds to everything else in an infinitely complex and yet kind of simple and natural way that is kind of endless, The architecture of the Divine Comedy, there's nothing like it in Western literature anyway. Nothing like it. It's so complex, but so well thought out and so clear and so natural. The ideas too, tremendous. Okay, in the Purgatory, Dante and Virgil come. I said it was nighttime, and they reach the shore and they look up at a huge mountain. This mountain, I think, is 7 times as high as Mount Everest. It's huge. Okay. So, and they go to the shore. Just as they arrive, a boat arrives coming across the ocean. In that boat are some souls of people who just died and are going to purgatory. They're singing. They're happy. Because the fact is, everybody who is in purgatory is happy. Why? Because they know they're saved. They will spend 1 year, 10 years, 1,000 years, 1,000,000 years, doesn't matter, in purgatory, until they are clean, cleansed of their sin, but they know that eventually they will enter paradise, and they're happy. They're so happy that they can't wait to be punished or cleansed in purgatory, because the sooner they are cleansed, the sooner they enter paradise. The mood then of purgatory is totally different. These people, it's true, look like they're being punished, but they're happy. They're really happy. Not in a twisted way, but in an understandable way, because they know they will go to paradise. They're full of the love of God and hope and faith, and they're just so thankful that they were granted salvation. Dante talks with various people. By the way, some of these people he knows personally. In hell too, he knew personally some of those people. Some are even relatives in hell or in purgatory or in paradise. One very famous relative in paradise. So, people from myth, Ulysses or Odysseus and many others, hundreds of them. People from Roman history, emperors, people from Italian history and European history, emperors again, high church officials and popes, and people whom he knew personally. All of them, 1,000 characters in the Divine Comedy. Some greater than others, but many memorable. Okay, so they begin their ascent, A-S-C-E-N-T, up Mount Purgatory. It's going to be hard. At the beginning, Dante is kind of heavy. His weight weighs him down. It's hard. He gets tired. He's exhausted. He has to sleep. His humanity weighs him down. But as he rises, as he learns more and more of what Mount Purgatory is, he becomes lighter. He becomes more full of joy, more full of knowledge of God, more full of hope to see God and paradise. And he rises faster and faster and faster, just like the souls in Purgatory. Just another little detail that is so meaningful in this poem, that is just full of meaningful, if not profound, details. So he rises and he talks with people at each stage, and always he's learning. Virgil is teaching him. Others are teaching him too. And the message is clear. The love of God is the best thing in the universe. The love of God is what makes the universe what it is. Everything in the universe acknowledges God as creator and motor force of the whole universe, and only a very twisted person would reject that knowledge and faith and the Christian faith, Dante says. But I'll tell you more about that in a minute. Dante is no fool. Okay, they rise ledge by ledge, sin by sin. By the way, the sins are arranged according to the 7 deadly sins. I'll tell you a quick way to remember the 7 deadly sins that I made up. I think many of you know agape, God's unconditional love. If you put an S and an L in front of it, it becomes slagape, a kind of ugly word. And slagape, if you remember that, this is one way to remember the 7 deadly sins. S, sloth, extreme laziness, even rejection of life, really. L, lust. Now, each of these is a sin, not because they're sinful in themselves, but when one makes gods of these things, when one tries to find the meaning of life in these things, then this is a distortion. This is a sin. This is insanity, really. A, avarice or greed. G, gluttony. Other A, anger. I cheat a little bit there because our word is usually wrath, W-R-A-T-H. I changed that to anger to fit slagape. P, pride. E, envy, slagape. Anyway, the 7 levels of Mount Purgatory, each one is one of the 7 deadly sins. There are 10 levels to each of the 3 realms, areas. 10 levels basically to hell, 10 levels purgatory, 10 levels paradise. 7 plus 3 others doesn't matter. Make 10. Dante rises more quickly and more quickly. At the top of Mount Purgatory, Dante must say farewell to Virgil. Very moving, but Dante controls the emotion, because after all, what he's saying goodbye to Virgil is human reason. Human reason cannot take him or anyone to paradise. Human reason cannot understand the mysteries of mysteries of the Christian religion, or any religion. Human religion and philosophy can guide one as far as reason can go, but no further. So of course Virgil must leave him. But Virgil, the man, must leave him also, because Virgil cannot be admitted to paradise. Virgil was a virtuous pagan, but only a pagan. And this tells us, I'm giving you a glimpse only of the allegory of the Divine Comedy. An allegory is kind of a symbolic story. And in an allegory, everything or almost everything should have multiple meanings. Just like Virgil has multiple meanings, and Dante and every character really has multiple meanings, every moment of the Divine Comedy has multiple meanings too. Now part of this is just basically literature. In literature, everything has symbolic meaning. If it doesn't, it's not serious literature. Multiple meanings, but it's all understandable in the Divine Comedy. Farewell to Virgil. And Dante enters what is at the top of Mount Purgatory, the earthly paradise. Now this is Eden, the Garden of Eden, before Adam and Eve were expelled from it, before Adam and Eve rejected it. So the idea here is that after one has been purged, one has recovered one's innocence, the same innocence that Adam and Eve had when they lived in the Garden of Eden. Dante enters the Garden of Eden. It's a beautiful woods, charming. The opposite of the dark woods that Dante was lost in, remember, at the very beginning of the poem. Dante wanders, and suddenly who appears? Beatrice. She appears and she scolds him, and she scolds him, and she scolds him. She's angry at him. How could you be so foolish? How could you be so stupid? How could you be so unfaithful to me? How could you be such a fool? And Dante Pilgrim, remember, breaks down and cries. She watches him for a while, and then she smiles. She forgives him. Now, what is happening in the allegory here? This is the Christian soul contrite, contrition. The beginning of salvation is contrition, that is, sincere regret for one's sins. And that's the condition of Dante right there. And certainly he must show contrition before he enters paradise. Wow, what an amazing thing. And Beatrice is theology. She's also divine grace. These are seen as kind of similar. Beatrice is not, Virgil was reason, but reason is far behind now. Beatrice is theology, which can lead a person to salvation, to God, and also divine grace, which can and does lead people to God. Okay, they wander around the woods and she lectures him and talks to him some more. And finally, at the very end of the Purgatorio, we get our final words, the stars, and Dante, and then we get the Paradiso. In the Paradiso, Dante and Beatrice now rise step by step by step. Now, each of these steps is seen kind of as heavenly bodies. The first, for example, they go to the moon. Then they go to Mercury. Then they go to Venus. Then they go to Mars. Then the Sun. Then Saturn, Jupiter, and then the primum mobile, as it's called, which is what makes everything move in the universe. And then finally to paradise itself and the Godhead. 10, 10, 10 divisions. In the paradise, Dante meets different souls at each one of these heavenly bodies. The moon, people who weren't very passionate but were saved in the last minute. Mercury, excitable people who were saved too. Venus, of course, the people who indulged in physical, sexual activities too much, but in the end they repented and were saved, and on and on and on. When Dante gets to the Sun, he finds King David of the Bible, Solomon of the Bible, and we're reminded that now these guys were before Christ, but in Christian legend, at least, Christ was crucified on Good Friday, as we call it. He descended into hell. What was he doing in hell? According to legend, really, he was taking out from hell the figures from the Old Testament, prophets, King David, King Solomon, Moses, of course, all the great figures from the Old Testament who deserved salvation because they kind of foresaw the Christian salvation story. Okay. And they all tell him many of the messages are very anti-Vatican. That is, the Pope and the Roman Catholic Church hierarchy were too interested in temporal power in this world, secular power, and all of heaven becomes angry, turns red at one moment when they think about the Pope and the Church pursuing earthly power. No wonder the Church has always been a little embarrassed by the Divine Comedy. But in wiser times now, wiser, maybe, we've just had time, the greatness of the poem and maybe the rightness of Dante in many things has to be acknowledged. Okay. In Mars, I'm not sure. Dante meets an ancestor of his, great, 4 greats, I think, grandfather. Cacciaguida was his name. It's a wonderful encounter. Dante's proud of him because he was I guess a great man, a great warrior in early Florentine history, Florence, Firenze. And they talk, and it's a wonderful conversation. Now remember the time of this, I didn't really explain, but remember back in that first stanza, Dante said that he was halfway through his life. Well, Dante was born in 1265. 35 is halfway to 70. When Dante was 35, it was 1300. 1265 plus 35 equals 1300. So the events of the Divine Comedy are supposed to take place in 1300. Well, Cacciaguida, his ancestor, predicts the things that will happen in Dante's life, 1300, predicts his exile, his wandering from place to place, the hard life, predicts many things. Other characters too also make predictions. Of course, these are things that Dante knew because Dante wrote the poem long after 1300. But the action is supposed to take place in 1300. So Dante rises step by step until he rises past the physical universe, and he's admitted into the Empyrean, as it's called, when suddenly all these great souls that were in Mercury or the moon, Mercury, Venus, blah, 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 all of these souls are gathered into one huge rose, the sempiternal rose. Okay. It turns out then that all these souls whom Dante has met on these planets, so to speak, in paradise, are not really there. They were simply sent there to help Dante understand things and to educate Dante. They are all, where are they? No place, of course, but they are now represented as sitting around a huge rose, and the rose, R-O-S-E, has places to sit, chairs, I guess. All of this is just symbolic, of course. And all of the blessed are there. The Virgin Mary, St. Peter, John the Baptist, all the saints, all the company of heaven are there. Then we get the great, great, great ending of this great, great poem. Okay. Beatrice takes her place in the rows next to St. Lucy and among her friends there. And then, but first, then Beatrice asks St. Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the great saints, died in 1149, and who was especially the saint of the Virgin Mary. Asks him to direct a prayer to the Godhead, the Trinity, Father, Son, Holy Ghost. Asks Bernard to pray to the, Beatrice asked Bernard to pray to the Virgin Mary for Dante, to allow Dante to see God. Great poem by St. Bernard as he addresses this prayer to the Virgin Mary. Very touching. Mary doesn't say anything, but she just turns with a smile toward the Godhead, thus directing Dante's vision toward the Godhead too. And so Dante's eyes shift from Mary to the Godhead. At first he's stunned, the brightness. Now he's been trained for this for the whole poem. The whole poem has been a training for this. Intellectually, emotionally, morally, this is the high point. So Dante's eyes fix on the Godhead, and at first it's just too dazzling, too overwhelming, too complex, too profound. But gradually he looks and looks and looks. And then in a sudden moment of illumination, he sees a human face emerge from there. The face of Christ, I suppose, the mystery of the incarnation, Christ's humanity. You could say something different, though, too. The strange mixture that are God and somehow humanity. At our deepest, at our best, there is this connection, this oneness, maybe, between the human soul and God. And therefore, what is ultimately real is in the human soul, deep, and in God. Well, this carries us to Indian religion and high points of many religions. Okay, Dante has his vision, the poem ends. The action of the poem has taken 1 week. It has taken place over Easter weekend, so that he's in hell on Good Friday when Christ was crucified. He enters he enters Purgatory on Easter Sunday, hope, salvation, and the whole poem takes a week. Now I'm going to suggest a couple of questions for you to consider. Discuss briefly the structure, just the most obvious features of the structure of the Divine Comedy. How many canti does it contain? What are the divisions? And what are the divisions that are referred to? Discuss the evolution and education of Dante Pilgrim, from the earliest stage to the latest stage. How does this take place? What happens? Who helps him? Who educates him? These are the two great questions where the Divine Comedy is concerned. Others are only footnotes to those two questions.